Hello, friends. I am Dr. Shaikh Parvez Aslam, Assistant Professor and Head Department of English, Lokseva Education Society's Arts and Science College, Aurangabad, affiliated to Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Marathwada University, Aurangabad, Maharashtra. Today, we are going to study about a poem by Robert Frost. The title of the poem is Stopping by Woods by on a Snowy Evening. Let us first know a short biography of Robert Frost. Robert Lee Frost stands as a towering personality among the American poets, not only of the 20th but probably all the centuries to come. He can be regarded as the crown on the head of American poetry. A widespread range of the themes in his poems make him the poet not only of New England but of the whole world. Robert Frost was born on March 26, 1874, in San Francisco, an American poet who depicted realistic New England life through language and situations familiar to the common man. He won four prestigious Pulitzer Prizes for his poems. His famous works include Fire and Ice, Mending Wall, Breaches. The Road Not Taken is often read at graduation ceremonies across the United States. As a special guest at President John E. Kennedy's inauguration, Frost became a poetic force and the unofficial poet laureate of the United States. Frost died January 29, 1963 at Boston, Massachusetts. Let us now have an information about the poem. Robert Frost's Nature Boy penned down this lovely poem in 1922 and which was composed in just one night, published with his long poems New Hampshire in 1923. He wrote this poem while living in the village of Franconia in New Hampshire. It seems that he was inspired to write the poem Stopping by Woods on a snowy evening by watching the woods near the village, and the village mentioned in the poem is probably Franconia. The present poem explores the motivations of the poet, the inherent moods of the narrator, and his fixation with woods for an inner reason. Excuse me. Multiple interpretation of these poems has been given by different critics. Some of the critics describe it as a description of a man appreciating nature. The poem is also about death. It talks about death and suicide. It addresses the issues of suicide. To nature lover sees it as peace that trumpets nature and scorns civilization. Let us now recite the text or the stanzas of this poem. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch the woods, to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little heart must think it cure to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bell a shake, the horse. He gives his harness bell a shake and asks if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, But I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. Stanza 1, I quote, whose woods desire I think I know. His house is in the village though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. Unquote. The poet begins the poem with his questioner approach, intentionally wondering that these woods seemed familiar to him at some point in time. The poet later on skips the identity in order to move along the imperative aspect of the poem. The poet points out at the presence of civilization nearby with the words house and village. The narrator is passing by someone's residence, is feeling chirpy and satisfied in his shadowy existence. He has stopped briefly to fully take in the wondrous view in front of him. Stanza second, and I quote, my little horse must think it cure to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. Unquote. The second stanza in the narrator seems to be considerate character interpreting the horse's thoughts. As per him, the horse seems to be surprised at this sudden intermission along the woods. Surely no man has business in this neck of the woods. His master is acting strangely. As the words indicate, the poet is bypassing the forest, yet the intensity of the winter cold has rendered the lake frozen, but the stubborn narrator seems to adore the immediate present as opposed to immediate danger. The narrator is hinting at the immense darkness awaiting him in the woods. Night time can be extremely distressing for the weary traveler miles away from home. The poet is torn between two choices yet again, to head home or sink in the scenic view. The third stanza, he gives his harness bell a shake to ask if there is some mistake. The only other sounds the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. During the during the stanza 3, the narrator continues to narrate the horse mind which currently shakes his bell to trudge along the road. The bell's jingle playfully indicate the horse's inclination to leave the woods for good, which feels gloomy and solitary. Since the horse can't speak his mind, the narrator chooses to, for him, the animal is awaiting the hold up to end and continue on his path towards his home. The poet is miles from anywhere but buried deep in the woods where the only sound is that wind and snowflakes falling. It is Robert Frost's imagery at its best. The poet affirms only three sounds in thick woods: wind, snow, and bell ringing. Stanza 4, the woods are lovely, dark, and deep, but I have promises to keep, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. This is a very important stanza of the poem, that is the concluding stanza, and the last two lines have become immortal, and miles to go before I sleep, and miles to go before I sleep. The narrator admits feeling transfixed at the woods, enveloped in the nature's exquisite beauty. The point has been driven from already, but the poet is getting worried. As darkness draws nigh, he has to resume. Truly, the woods are dark and enchanting in their own right, yet they can also be merciless. Using but, the poet demonstrates intense longing to stay, but put in his position, observing the beauty at his disposal. The concluding two verses of the poem are clincher from the poet's perspective. It's also the most celebrated two lines of English poetry. The initial line, and miles to go before I sleep, remains within the poetic parameters defined in poetic genre. Then the poet repeats the above line again, reinforcing for a more internal message. In actually, the poet is hinting at death, which will come eventually as he reaches the end of his years. The crux of the poem lies in the conflict in a moment of solace versus pending obligations. The narrator is definitely spellbounded by the excuse me by the momentary distraction from the worldly responsibilities, allowing himself a moment of peace. Being naturalistic to the core, Robert Frost grounds his characters in a forest. Mesmerized by the snowy evening, the poet mildly indicates the presence of a human close by, obviously to the passerby. The structure of the poem, a love for nature, imagery, and personification are found recurrently in his poem. He termed it as his best effort for remembrance. Readers, students, and children alike have taken a liking to this naturalistic poem. It has rhyme and reason flows systematically throughout the poem. It works within Rubaiyat stanza. Rubaiyat, what is Rubaiyat? Rubaiyat is a poem using stanzas called Rubai. This is a quatrain, four-line stanza written in iambic pentameter or tetrameter. The rhyme scheme is AABA. The Rubaiyat stanza is also called the Umar stanza. A well-known example in the modern poet literature is Stopping by Woods by Robert Frost. Rubaiyat is a Persian term for quatrain denoting four-line stanza. The scheme of Rubaiyat is AABA, BBCB, CCDC, DDDD. The poetic devices used in this poem are metaphor, imagery, personification, and repetition. Theme is about this poem is keeping promises, traveling miles. The poem has a side melancholy or calm tone. The mood of the poem, the main emotion in the poem is called the mood. Robert Frost's poem Stopping by Woods on a Snowy Evening has an example of connotative and denotative word meanings. Fourth stanza, third and fourth lines. The word sleep is an example. Denotatively, sleep means to take the rest afforded by a suspension of voluntary bodily functions. How Frost means asleep, though in the connotative meaning, and for sleep means death. This changes the meaning of the lines completely. This is a very important poem in American literature written by Robert Frost. Thank you so much.